Okay. Continue the halachas of the prohibition of eating and drinking on Yom Kippur from the Alter Rebbe Shulchan Aruch, from the Alter Rebbe's Code of Jewish Law, Orach Chaim, chapter or section 612, Tafrei Shud Beis. You're on halacha Yud Beis, subsection 12. So yesterday we went through the details of eating, the size, the threshold for liability, even though of course it's prohibited to drink or to eat any amount, but the threshold for liability is a large date, which we discussed is, 58.3 grams or something like that. That was the number we gave yesterday. And we talked about 53.8, not 58.3, other way around. Yeah, I think you're right, 53.8. And we talked about how food combines, various different types of food combine to push one over the threshold. And that the combination of all these foods to push one over the threshold has to be eaten within the span of the amount of time it takes to eat 4 eggs, which is a meal, which is a half a loaf. And we talked about how food and drink do not combine, but liquids that augment food, or salt, anything that augments the food itself, is combined to push one over the edge of prohibition, of liability, We also discussed eating obnoxiously does not take on liability, which is the example of this is someone who stuffs himself before Yom Kippur, and the moment Yom Kippur starts, eats more, in which case it's unenjoyable and dangerous, thus doesn't qualify for what Torah says, the punishment for someone who does not self-inflict pain, and this person is inflicting pain upon himself. And therefore, following this logic, says the Alter Rebbe, based on some later commentaries, not from the Gemara, but it would seem reasonable, and this remains the halacha, that if one were to eat a candy, even if they were stuffed, the candy is still enjoyable. Likewise, a Danish, or something like dessert, right? There's always room for dessert, we learned. And therefore, even if someone ate a full meal just before Yom Kippur started, and then on Yom Kippur ate a dessert, even though instead of the dessert, the person was eating a slice of bread, it would have been liable. But because he ate a dessert, which is enjoyable, reverse. If he ate a slice of bread, he wouldn't have been liable because it's not enjoyable. But now that he's eating a dessert, which is enjoyable, he is liable. And therefore, if the person is stuffed to the point that even this dessert would be obnoxious, also not liable. And we talked about various different specific foods, like eating vine buds, if it's soft, not soft, eating dry ginger, dry peppers, which is not for human consumption, versus if it's still moist, if it's still wet, it is for human consumption, and things of that nature. Okay, so that, I think, brings us up to speed with where we are. Did I miss any important details? I think that was it. Okay, now we get to the rest of the chapter discussing the laws of drinking. One who drinks on Yom Kippur the amount of a full cheek, half a mouth. Chayev, he is liable. Again, prohibited to drink any amount, but here we're talking about liability. Masharin, we measure this not with a universal standard, but in accordance with the individual's mouth. Each person in accordance to what his mouth size is. So it could be different. The bigger one according to his bigger mouth, and the smaller one in accordance to the smaller size of his mouth. Doesn't mean actually the full entire cheek. Ella, rather, if you were to push the water or the liquid to one side of your mouth, it would make your cheek bulge, thus looking like your entire mouth is full, then it's liable. And this is less than a quarter of a lug, which is known as a revius. Revius means a quarter. Then this is the average person is smaller than this revius. So what did they put in the footnote? Revius literally means a quarter. Okay, the name of the fluid is the name of this fluid measured is sometimes pronounced log. Okay, whatever. According to Shulchan Aruch, again, this book from Rabbi Chaim, which you mentioned yesterday, a revius is 86 What's cc? Okay, it's milliliters. That makes more sense. Though it's cubic centimeters, that's what it is. Okay. Though a cheekful is not the standard measure, Shir Torah maintains that for an average person, a cheekful can safely be considered as 42 milliliters, approximately half a revius. A person anticipates the possibility that he will need to drink in small amounts, which on Yom Kippur should make appropriate preparations beforehand. Again, this is what I mentioned last time, that when we get to the laws of someone who's sick, we'll see that a person who may eat in Yom Kippur because they're sick, what we try to, or a pregnant person or some pregnant woman or someone who just gave birth, something of that nature, which the details of which we'll discuss later, but we try to make them avoid eating to the point that they pass the threshold of liability, even if they have to eat in Yom Kippur. This is called eating l'sheyurin, eating to the number, to the measures. So when it comes to the food, there's a universal standard. You make sure it's less than 53.8 grams, or be safe, make sure it's under 45 grams, right? But when it comes to liquids, because it's a subjective thing to each person's mouth, they have to prepare before. And therefore, what does he do? He should empty a bloated cheekful of water into an empty glass. So fill up your mouth to the max, empty it into a cup, and mark the level of water. All right? Or I'm sorry, fill up your mouth and push the liquid to the side so that it looks like it's full. So that what? Yeah, the half a cheek. And then put it into the glass, mark the point where it is, and liquid beneath this line will be within this quota. Okay, so just like when it comes to food, all food combined to push one over the threshold, so too kolomashkim mitzvah from zem zel lahashkim lugmov, all liquid is combined to push one over the edge and make one liable. Yudalid 14. In the same way when it comes to food, someone who eats food that is not for human consumption, eating bark or something like that, they're not liable, even though it might be prohibited. So likewise, the same thing is true of liquids. A person drinks liquid that's not for consumption. Could go in sir, which again is this brine, this water, this like, it's water filled with, what, sorry? Salt water, yes. I guess a modern version of this is salad dressing, just to gulp down salad dressing. Oimurdis, or fish brine, like what we call in Yiddish yoyach. You know, the liquid that's around the fish. Maybe you eat it with your fish, eat it with the challah, not plain. Okay, perish sir shaldagim, basically it's the brine of fish. Oichoimetz chai, or pure, undiluted vinegar. Yes, not for human consumption. Perish means to say, einamozig chai literally means living. But this means, as he explains in parentheses, einamozig mayim, it's not diluted by water, which is the way they used to, I guess they still prepare vinegar that way, but they used to prepare wine, oil, all that stuff by diluting it with water. When we buy it, it's already diluted. Sorry? Of what? Of wine? Vinegar says only 5% vinegar. When you buy vinegar, it's 5% vinegar and 95% water? Really? Wow. I guess it's that strong. Maybe there's other ingredients in there too. Wow, okay. I mean, the wine we buy is anyways pre-diluted, and all this stuff's all pre-diluted, but back in the day, you have to dilute it yourself. So drinking undiluted vinegar, that is definitely not for human consumption. It is so strong, this vinegar, if you were to pour it onto the ground, it would like cause bubbles, chemical reaction of some sort. Our vinegar does not do that, so I guess it's not as strong. So if you can't drink our vinegar, you definitely cannot drink this vinegar. Anyway, even if you drank tons of it, even though it's prohibited, one is still exempt from kares, from excision. Aval but makanas and makas mardis, he gets this rabbinic version of lashes, this disciplinary action that Bezdin takes to keep people in check. But if you drank vinegar that's diluted, and I guess it's diluted to the point that it's actually drinkable. I mean, I can't see our vinegar being drinkable. Maybe you got to dilute it even more. Sorry? To drink vinegar out of a glass? Yeah, so I don't mind heavy. I don't mind addressing heavy on vinegar, but drinking it out of a cup is a bit different, right? If I pour it on the salad dressing, then it actually combines with food for liability. It doesn't combine with liquid. But I don't know. Maybe back in the day, people had a higher tolerance, and people drank this stuff. I don't know. At any rate, if a person does drink diluted vinegar, then even if he only drank that cheekful, again, so long as he drank that cheekful, chayav, liable. Okay, so in the same way, different foods combine, and foods combine in intervals, right? So long as it's within a certain time frame. The same thing is true of liquids. So drinking different drinks at different times combine together, also within a time frame, as we'll see. Going, for example, person drank a tiny drop, and then stopped a bit, and then again went and drank again a little bit. And combining these two together, it reaches the amount of a cheekful. Chayav is liable. The same thing with food, right? A person eats a little bit of bread, and then a few minutes later eats another little bit of bread, and the two together reach the threshold of the size of a large date, liable. But the same thing is, just as it was when it came to food, it had to be eaten within a certain time frame. Same thing is true of drinking. All this is true. This is only true if the drinking, the first drink and the last drink, all of which together combine for the size of it, for the size of a cheekful. This is all of Yosim Mikdesh Dias Revias Lug.
That's not very long.
Sorry?
Not very long.
Yes, it has to be drunk within the time frame it takes to drink a Revias, which again was how many ounces? I think it's about 3 and something ounces. Before he gave it in what was it, squared cubicles? What's it called? Cubical centimeters, but it's about 3.5 ounces, roughly. Something like that. It's only about 3.5 ounces. So, no, not to gulp it down, to drink it down properly. 10, 15 seconds, I don't know. So you can take pauses, you can do drinks much more quickly than food. But let's see. But there's another opinion. Okay, so according to this opinion, it would be very quick. But if a person waited between each little drink more than the amount of time it takes to drink this revius, then they don't combine. But the yesh others disagree and say, no, the same distance of time required for food, or the same distance required for drink. And then namely, they always combine. If the first and last drink was so long as it was within the time frame, the amount of time it takes to eat a meal, which again is a half a loaf, which again is for size of 4 eggs. It's about 8-9 minutes. In the same way that 2 types of food are combined. So even though the measure for the amount of food and the amount of drink is different for liability, the time frame within which they have to be drunk to reach liability is the same. And therefore, when it comes to halacha, in the first instance, one should be more strict, and follow the latter view and wait the entire time. If they were, again, this is all for somebody who's sick and has to rely on eating the measurement amounts, eating l'shiyudin, then they should rather stick to the latter opinion and wait those 8-9 minutes before they have the next drink. So as I mentioned last time, because food and drink don't combine, what you end up doing is, what's very often advised is, eat something, wait 3, 4, or 5 minutes, drink something, 4 or 5 minutes, eat something, and then 4 or 5 minutes, drink something. And that way the drinks are staggered from each other by 10 minutes or 12 minutes. The food is staggered from each other by 4 minutes, but you're still putting something in your mouth in a quicker amount of time because the drink and the food don't combine. That's right. So someone who needs that, someone's always getting more nourishment, but never reaches liability because their food and drink are staggered and you put them in. Correct. But it is so you only have 4 or 5 minute break in between each. That's correct. But however, there are instances where a person needs to drink water, dehydration of some sort, and the person needs to drink water more quickly. Then if you can, rely on the other opinion. Wait 15 seconds before each gulp of water. And that way, at least according to the second opinion, or according to the first opinion, you haven't reached the level of culpability. But again, as he says, in the first instance, you should be strict. But if it can't be done, then do the other opinion, at least the other opinion. So at least then, at least according to that opinion, you haven't reached liability. Okay, 15 and final halacha. 16 and final halacha. All of the laws that have been discussed in this section, whether we talked about the amount the amount of food for culpability, for eating, or the amount of drink for culpability, for drinking, is only respect to bringing a sin offering if it was done unintentionally, or if it was done intentionally, kares, excision. And that's why he says here, what's the difference to us if we don't have base midrash, we're not bringing offerings? To us, there also is a practical application for a sick person who is in danger. As we'll explain in later chapter, when we get there, after we learn the Gemara about it, as I already alluded to, this idea that if a person's sick, we try, and the person needs to eat, we try at least to feed the person in such a manner that they're not liable for kares. Aval inyan iser. So all this is true with respect to the issue of liability, chatas and kares, and that's applied to one who is sick and needs to break the rules, and thus we want to make them break the rules without culpability. Aval but inyan iser, but with respect to the prohibition of itself, even if he ate tiniest amount, or drank the tiniest amount, this person violated a biblical commandment. That means he's following Rabbi Yochanan, not Rish Lakish. Remember from the beginning of the Gemara, so before we were sitting together, but it's one of the earlier recordings when we introduced this idea of chatzi shir, the prohibition to eat or drink less than the amount for culpability, and there's a dispute whether it's biblical or rabbinic. And here the Alter Rebbe is ruling, as most people do, rule that it is biblical. The same thing is true of every single prohibition of Torah, of which we have amounts for liability. Even the tiniest amount is prohibited, even though there's no culpability. Classic example of this is, it's Rabbi Yochanan in the Gemara. A classic example of this is theft. Stealing the tiniest amount is prohibited by Torah law, even the tiniest amount. But one is not liable to pay back, and all the other penalties that come along with someone who steals, unless they have stolen a shava pruta, which means it has to have some value. Again, this gets back to this idea that, in other words, when you say a negative thing, don't do something, the don't do could be at the minimum amount. But when you say do something, or there is consequences for having done something, then the doing has to have some measurable amount. Right? In math, you have this. There's two ways to look at a dot. How do you define a dot? How do you define a dot or a point? Do you find a point by the shetach, by the space that it takes up? Or do you find the point by what it's not? Right? Because a point, you would really, if you could, you make it smaller. You can't make it any smaller. Right? So the point is actually what it's not. So when you're saying don't do something, you can reduce it to its absolute minimum. Don't do anything. But when you're saying do something, then there has to be a certain measure in which you say, okay, now you've done it. Likewise, when you say you are culpable for having done something, you have to have a certain measure to say you have now done it and therefore culpable. And therefore we have to look at each item and say, what's the prohibition? Prohibition is eating. Okay, so define, have you eaten? When we say don't eat, don't take anything, you can reduce it to zero. But when you're told if you have eaten, you're now liable, well, how do we define eating? It's going to be kazayas. And likewise on Yom Kippur, you have to have eaten, you have to have satisfied yourself. And for benching, you have to have more than just satisfied yourself, not just taking off the edge. You have to satisfy yourself, and so on. Something is true of stealing. Don't steal means don't do anything. But now that you've stolen, there's retribution. We have to qualify. Have you actually stolen something worth our retribution? Okay, so this concludes our halachas. God willing, I may be going with the family on Sunday, Monday. So I don't know if I'm going to be here Monday and Tuesday, but we'll be in touch, B'ez Hashem, and we'll continue, God willing, our Gemara, the Mishnah on Pei Aleph, Amud Aleph, is it, right? Right, we're Mishnah on 81a. That's what we're going to continue, God willing, in our next year. A wonderful day and a wonderful Shabbos, everybody. Shabbos Mevorachim Elul. It's a big Shabbos this week. The Elul winds the Tshuva winds are blowing. As the expression goes. Yeah, thank you.